What's up everyone, welcome back to the channel and to another 3D model. This week, we're going to be making some Western buildings. And these specific buildings are actually based off of some buildings in the video game Red Dead Redemption. Now it's been, I don't even remember how long since I played this game, and over the past week I decided to dust off my old PlayStation 4 and just jump on Red Dead Redemption since it's been so long since I played this game. And to be honest with you, I completely forgot about how amazing this game is. And it really got me thinking and wanting to recreate something similar for this week's video. So I decided to go to one of the towns, I believe it's called Valentine, I'm not entirely sure to be honest with you, but I saw some buildings that I was just very inspired from and I thought it'd be a lot of fun to recreate. So I took a few quick snapshots on my iPad of these specific buildings. One of them is a sheriff building, a drug store building, and also a general store at the end of the street here. Now, I decided to take a bunch of different ideas from these buildings and incorporate them into my model. Now, we're going to try to recreate these basically, but I'm not going to stress about getting them perfect. In fact, I'm going to kind of combine two ideas from the drugstore and the general store kind of into one. But we're going to have some fun this week and we're going to try to get through this as quickly as possible. Now, I'm not going to lie to you, looking back now, I probably should have just done one building. Actually, I kind of wish I did because I feel like I could have invested a little bit more time into adding more objects and making it look a little bit more realistic rather than rushing through this to try to get this done on time. I really only had one day to get all of the modeling done, so I spent around 4 hours-ish on the 3D modeling. And like I said, I wanted to combine these two buildings into one. I thought it'd be fun to kind of have two different looks, one sheriff building and one drugstore side by side. And obviously that just means more time. Now, sometimes when I'm starting these models, I'm too confident and I feel like it's not going to take too much time. And then I realize, oh yeah, I have to UV all of this. And the UVing usually takes almost as much time as the modeling takes. So it did definitely take more time than I expected it to. So I had to rush some things and cut some corners. And that's why we're going to simplify a lot of these shapes just to make the whole process a little bit quicker. Now, if I were to go back and redo this whole project, I would definitely focus on one building. That way I can add some more interesting things to the scene and make a lot of these objects more complex and more unique rather than just simplifying some simple cases, wood, barrels and stuff like that. I can make a little bit more unique objects in there. Like I really like the general store from Red Dead. There was so many objects hanging in front and little things along the street. And that's one thing I wish I could have added more to this model if I had more time. So anybody else wishing or wanting to recreate a similar thing like this, I would just focus on one building. That way you can make it a little bit more unique and more fun to look at. So of course, the main thing was blocking all those main shapes out. So that's what we're gonna do first. We're just gonna block everything out roughly. I'm not gonna worry about adding in that detail right away. We're just gonna use these images that I gathered from Red Dead. That way we can start blocking out all of those main objects. Now there were a few different directions I decided to take while modeling this. For example, one of the buildings, the sheriff building, I decided just to leave simple planes as the walls, and then we can add some sort of paneling texture like wood panels on those simple planes later on in Substance Painter. And for the general store, I decided to add a bit more detail and actually model each an individual wood piece along those walls. And near the end of the whole process, I decided to gut all of that. Since I really was running out of time, I decided to simplify it and just go back to the original idea of just adding simple planes. So there's different methods you can use. Obviously, if it's for a video game asset, you definitely want to cut back on those polys. So keeping it simple and just using simple planes for the walls makes the most sense. But you can actually combine the both ideas into one kind of a high and poly model workflow where you can create those individual panels to create that bump on your normal map. And then you can just use the simple planes as your in-game asset. So there's different approaches you can take depending on how these models are going to be used. Of course, if it's for a real video game, you would try to cut back, like I said, as much as you can. But we're just having fun here, so I thought I would do two different approaches, but near the end of the video, I just decided to go with the one. Another thing I decided to do was make the windows see-through. So originally I was just planning on making those windows kind of a little bit transparent, but more reflective so you really wouldn't see anything on the inside. And I realized adding some blinds or something like drapes behind them would just make it look more fun and similar to the reference photo. So I didn't actually add that in the recording. I just really quickly just basically added some edge loops on the flat planes where the walls are and just to delete some faces behind the windows. That way I can quickly add some sort of drape behind it And I didn't spend too long on that part, but it's just something I decided to add last minute. And when it came to the textures, I actually decided to use a lot of the assets that come on the Substance Painter website, the ones you can download into your project. If you're paying for Substance Painter, you should be able to access all of these for free. But rather than just using a lot of the built-in materials, I decided to use some of those downloadable materials just to make the whole process quicker. After I was done the whole UV mapping, I really didn't have much time left, so I thought that would probably be the quickest approach I can do just to finish everything up and wrap up the project. Now, don't forget, you can find this full video in real time, which includes everything, including the whole UV mapping process, and that will all be available on my Patreon page, which you can find in the link in the description below. And there's also all the working files, so if you're interested in seeing how I did all those textures in Substance Painter, or you want access to the 3D models, they will all be available on there. Now, a few more things I wanted to mention about other things I wish I could add into this model, and one of the big ones was dealing with the floor. So one thing that I wish I changed up or I made different was all those floor panels, they're pretty straight and everything's in line, which is fine. It looked pretty good. I was still happy with how it turned out, but I feel like I could have messed up some of those boards a little bit, made them a bit more crooked, not everything so perfectly straight, and I feel like it would have just added a little bit more to the scene. Since it's an old Western environment, nothing would be perfect, and especially the edges of those wood panels, I feel like if I just made them more rough and jagged and pointy, like some were broken, I feel like it just would have added a lot more to the scene. So that's definitely one thing I wish I added. And of course, just adding more objects. I feel like, especially around that general store, I really like the one in Red Dead with all the little fruit baskets and the hanging lanterns and the pans, and just all the little elements in there really make it interesting to look at. So that's one thing I would definitely add more if I did have more time. Anyways, like I said, we don't have a lot of time to get this one done. Let's try to get through it as quickly as possible. So let's just continue blocking out all these main shapes. We can slowly piece together these old Western buildings. Alright, so before we jump into those UVs, I just quickly want to give a shout out to this week's video sponsor, PCBWay. PCBWay offers a variety of services ranging from PCB production, sheet metal fabrication, injection molding, 3D printing, and much more. You can quickly upload your own files and get a quote immediately, so if you're building something at home or want to print one of your own 3D models, PCBWay makes it extremely easy to get custom parts for your projects, even if you don't have the necessary tools. They take care of everything so you can get those parts shipped directly to your front door. So if you're working on a project or need 3D printing or any of these other services, make sure to check them out in the description below. And once again, thank you PCBWay for sponsoring this week's video. Alright, so here are the Western buildings in its finished form. Now everything is basically the exact same. There are a few small things that I decided to change last minute. Some of them I actually decided to quickly jump into Maya while I was like halfway through the texturing or even at the end of the texturing process, just to add a bit more detail in some certain areas. And I'll show you that right now. So the main one was basically deleting these faces behind the windows. So I went ahead and just added some quick just edge loops. That way I can select those faces and delete them. That way I can add a separate plane in front or behind to act as some sort of glass. And then behind that, I can add just some sort of drape material or object. And for the drapes, I've done this in many other videos. If you're interested in seeing the process, I just didn't record it. I did it very last minute, so I just quickly did it. But under the effects tab, I basically added a simple plane like this, added a bunch of edge loops to increase the polys, and then using end cloth, you can add some constraints on the top and kind of drop it using physics to look like some sort of drape-like material or object. And then after I created one, I just basically duplicated the same drape behind every other window. So I went through all of these and went ahead and just deleted those faces. That way I can see through the window. And after adding one also for the actual window itself, I added the drape behind that. And this one actually has two windows, which I didn't realize. But anyways, that's basically the main difference or the main change that I did to the model. And the other one was just removing all the siding. So if you were following along in the video, you probably noticed that I modeled each individual wood panel. And I thought it'd just be cool to see that bump. But to be honest with you, it was very time consuming. It was also unrealistic for a video game model. And since these are based off of an actual video game asset, I just thought it would only make more sense to model it like our sheriff building by just adding that detail directly into the materials rather than actually creating it into the geometry. Now, like I said, you could do both methods. So I could add that wood paneling to add it into the bump, just so you can actually, in a high and low poly model workflow, so you can actually see that bump in the normals. But to be honest with you, there's some really cool materials on the Substance Source website, and I just decided to download some and just add that directly into the material instead, which I think looks just as cool, and it's also so much more time consuming. So I did, yes, go ahead and just deleted all of that and went with just the simple planes that I originally created. Now, there are a few things, like I said, that I wish I could have added, a lot of them just being more objects. I should have duplicated even more of these sandbags or a lot of these boxes and barrels and just basically moved them and duplicated them all around the scene. I feel like we could have made it look a lot more busy, which would just make it more interesting and fun to look at. But I just ran out of time, especially up here. There's really nothing going on. Up here, it would have been cool to add some more objects, maybe some cloth things like sheets kind of hanging over the balcony here. And there's just so much we could have done. Maybe a noose kind of hanging here, just hanging or something like that. I don't know. There's really endless options, but by making it look more busy, it definitely would have been more interesting. And if I had more time, that's definitely something that I would have done. Or even a small carriage would have been really cool. Just here sitting on the side. That actually would have been really cool. Even with like a lot of these boxes inside the back of the carriage. So it looks like they're almost transporting those boxes into the general store. I just saw that right now. That actually is something I wish I'd done. That would have been really cool. Anyways, if I had more time, I definitely would have done more. But it is what it is. I'm still really happy with how it turned out. And so let's just go over the textures. So as you can see in my Western Buildings folder, I decided to add a group for each texture. Now, I didn't bother spending too much time condensing these textures. Of course, the amount of textures you use is extremely important, especially for video game assets. So just keep that in mind, depending on how your asset's going to be used. Cutting back on the amount of textures you use is something that's extremely important. I obviously was not throwing this in the video game. It was more just for fun. So I wasn't really focused on optimizing this mesh by any means. So like I said, I broke it up into textures or groups for each different texture. So if I open up my UV editor, I'll show you how I laid these out. So the first one was the jail cells. I knew I wanted to have some sort of brick pattern on these jail cells similar to our reference photo. So I wanted to have that detail and not really cut back on that resolution by making those shells quite small. So I decided to break this up into its own group. Of course, making sure that the shells are nice and straight. That way I can apply the materials really simply and straightforward without having to skew them or rotate them to align correctly to my walls. Another really important thing with having straight UV shells is you can condense it more and you can fit them tighter together to just make room for more shells. So having your shells nice and straight is always really important. So the second group and texture is all the wood pieces. So I thought it just makes sense to add all the floor pieces together into its own group. And a lot of these are actually overlapping. I know it looks a little bit messy right now, but basically these ones are just cut overlapping each other and flipping them. That way you wouldn't see repeating patterns and they can still use technically the same UV space. So I went ahead with these floor ones as well. So if I click on a bunch, you'll see that some of them are going to be overlapping, like these two. And they start just overlapping in different spots. So that way, like I said, you wouldn't see repeating patterns. And another trick is also taking some of these and just flipping them around. So the ones that were sharing the same UV space, I tried to just flip some around. So once again, you just wouldn't see too much of a repeating pattern. I'm sure if you stared at it close enough, you would see some, but there's just a few tricks I did to try to avoid seeing those repeating patterns. So as you can see, all of these basically share a few different spaces, not all of them, but a lot of them do. And the ones that do, I just tried to flip them around. So the second group was just all of the wood. The third group was all the objects. So basically all the objects. So this one moved over. Sorry, I think I'm using another file save. This isn't the most recent one, so this should be, oh, there we go. I don't know if it happens to anybody else, but sometimes when you open your UV editor, like shells are moved and you just have to like move them and Control Z and they snap back into place. I don't know if that just happens to me, but I swear it's a weird thing that sometimes happens, which you just saw. Same with this one. I'm sure I can move these, Control Z, see, and they snap back. Anyways, weird glitch. But these are all the objects. So once again, all the barrels are sharing the same UV space. All the boxes are sharing the same UV space. I knew that you wouldn't see a repeating pattern with those. Same with all these little sandbag things. They're all sharing the same UV space. And the fourth texture is this building. So I decided to split each building into its own texture group. Now, because all the windows were sharing the same UV space, I just quickly kept those in the same texture group rather than sharing. You know, there's no detail on the window, so I thought it would just make sense just to keep them all on one group. So the windows from the second building are technically on this texture group. And a big reason for that as well, just because I did it last minute, so it just made more sense. But once again, for this one of the most important things was keeping these shells nice and straight. Because I was planning on having a straight wood pattern on them, I needed that shell to be nice and straight, so it would just make sense while applying those materials. And the fifth one is just the opposite building, so the exact same thing. This one I decided to add this front little porch cover as well, just to take advantage of the UV space. But just once again, making sure those shells are nice and straight. And then the last group was everything else in the scene. So all those drapes I added last minute. What else did I add? Just the doors, the chimney, the street wires, the little horse tie-up things, and all the doors as well. So a lot of these doors, these back doors, are sharing the exact same UV space as well. But I decided to break this off in its own group just to make my life a little bit easier. And originally the signs weren't part of a UV group, but I decided just to break this off as well, just so I can get some nice resolution out of the words. That way I can just really didn't have to worry about it. As you can see, there's a little bit of unnecessary wasted space here, which I probably could have taken advantage of a little bit more, but I was really rushing the UV process at the end. So once again, just simplified it for myself and broke this off into its own group. And that is how I prepared my Western building. So I applied a different material. So technically there's 7 materials in this whole asset group. Now I also just recently downloaded the new Maya, which makes a material stack. I'm not sure what this is, but I have to look into this because this was never here before. And for some reason when I created my materials, there's like a new list for creating materials too, which I don't know how I feel about. I don't like change too much, but it is what it is. So there's a few things I need to update myself with. So I'm not sure exactly what this is right now. And then I basically inserted a plane. I just did this really quickly so I can make sure all my objects were nice and level. So in Substance, since I did my rendering right out of Substance Painter, I just wanted to make the floor hit all these objects so nothing was hovering above. So I just quickly added this, which is technically not part of the model, but that's why that's there as well. All right, so now I just need to export this thing. We can jump over to Substance Painter and we can start the texturing process. Don't forget, if you want to see the full UV mapping process, it will be part of that real-time video, which will be uploaded to my Patreon page. All right, so now jumping over to Substance Painter, we can go ahead and start our texturing. Now for this one, I was basically using those reference images that I took out of Red Dead Redemption as my main reference. I was basically working towards recreating the exact same look, but also not being completely stuck on that idea. I was going to experiment a tiny bit. But the main thing that I was going to do with this one was not focus on getting everything perfect right away. Because there's so many objects in the scene, I find the quickest way to work if you're needing to work quickly is just fill in all those empty meshes with materials, and then we can refine them and tweak them later on. So that's exactly what I'm going to do. Not only that, but I'm also going to use a lot of the built-in materials that are available on the Substance Source website. So all the wood panels for all the walls, as well as the brick around the jail, I just downloaded those off the Substance Source website, and then I can quickly apply those to my models. This just saved me a ton of time rather than recreating them from scratch or just kind of building it up using the ones that come with the painter. Having these available on the Substance Source website just makes the process extremely helpful and quick. And that's the main thing I was worried about with this video. By the time I was done all the modeling and the UVing, we really didn't have a lot of time to do the texturing. So I'm going to use that to my full advantage and download some of those, which you can see here in my library, and we can apply those to those meshes. Now, like I said, I'm not going to worry about getting everything perfect, so we're not going to add any dirt and grunge right away. I know sometimes in some of my videos, I add those fill layers and add smart masks to start adding different grunge and reflective materials on top of the materials, but we're not going to do that right now. I find that's just going to drag out the process, so we're just going to start filling in these meshes with some sort of material, and at the end of the video, we can come back and add a bit more dirt and grime to make it look more dirty. Of course, this is a Western environment, so it's not going to look nice and clean, so we will have to experiment with some of that at the very end. But other than that, it's pretty straightforward. We're just going to start filling in these meshes and start texturing our scene. And then also, one thing for all of the words, I find a lot of the fonts in Substance Painter, they're pretty straightforward, and there's a certain look I find with Western fonts. They didn't have a lot available back then. So I had to jump into Photoshop to create some alphas for some of the words. So some of the main words on the buildings like the sheriff and the Polly's general store, I just created those in Photoshop by just searching different fonts. I found some on the Adobe font website as well that I just downloaded into my Photoshop file. That way I can just quickly create that alpha, drag them out, and I can stamp those directly onto my mesh. And I also did that for those little signs as well. I used some of the built-in fonts that come with Substance Painter, but I found most of them were pretty straightforward and more modern looking. So I found some unique ones or ones that I thought were a bit more fitting and just decided to choose that route for a lot of the lettering. Now, don't forget, you can find this full texturing process in real time, which will be available on my Patreon page, which you can find in the link in the description below. Oh, and one more thing also for those wanted posters, as well as the apples, the for sale Apple poster or sign, and a few of the other small ones on the building. I just found some images on Google Images for those rather than recreating those from scratch. Like I said, there was a lot of rushing going on at the end of this video to get it done on time. So to make that process a little bit easier on myself, I just found some on this, basically on Google Images, and just downloaded those to stamp those directly onto the mesh. But that's basically everything. It's fairly straightforward. At this point, we just need to start filling in those meshes, and we can slowly piece together our Western building. All right, and that is basically everything. That is the whole 3D modeling, UV mapping, and texturing process that I did to create these old Western Red Dead Redemption buildings. I really hope you guys enjoyed this week's video. I know it was a bit different than usual. Rather than creating a small asset, I decided to create a small little scene, but it was a lot of fun, and I also forgot how awesome Red Dead is as a game. It's been quite some time. If you've never played it, I'd be pretty blown away, and you should definitely go download it and play it ASAP. Anyways, let me know what you thought about this video. Please consider subscribing to the channel or liking this video, and also go check out my Patreon page. It's by far the best way to help support my art and support these videos, and you can also get access to real-time videos, some tutorial-based videos, and also 3D models. Alright, thanks so much for tuning into this week's video, and I will catch you all in the next one.